Welcome and thanks for listening to another episode of CRO Cafe. In this episode, I talk to designer, developer, and optimizer Matt Beischel. He runs his own agency, Corvus CRO, and we discuss automating parts of your CRO workflow so you can keep focusing on the fun parts of the job. My name is Guido Jansen and welcome to CRO Cafe, the podcast where I show you the behind the scenes of optimization teams and talk with their specialists about data and human-driven optimization and implementing a culture of experimentation and validation. In case you missed it, in the previous episode I spoke to Sean Shepard from GrowthX about why CRO specialists like you and me should actually be thinking like venture capitalists. You can find that episode on cro.cafe/episodes or in the podcast app you're listening with right now. This episode of CRO Cafe is made possible by our partners Content Square, Convert.com, Online Dialogue, and SiteSpect. So Matt, welcome to the show and tell us a little bit about your background and how you are working with CRO.
Yeah, so I have a fine arts background. I got into doing print design in high school through working on a yearbook and taking art classes and stuff like that. So that really got me interested in the field of design. And from there, in college, majored in actually 3D animation because I wanted to be like a animator and maybe get into video games and stuff, but discovered I wasn't really passionate about it. Like you're working on something for a super, super long time and you get maybe like a minute's worth of work.
Yeah.
And so I stayed still taking design classes and things on the side, and web design was like a really new space then. And that really interested me. So after leaving college, I got work in print and worked in direct mail and catalog production for a couple years, and then transitioned into web design and then web development, landed at an e-commerce company where I was really able to use all of those design and dev skills to work on e-commerce sites. But as just a developer, I was always asking these questions. We're like, okay, we're working on our client sites and making changes and updates and, redesigning pages and altering UIs and all of those different things. How do we know they're paying us to do all this work? How do we know that it's actually beneficial? And so that's how I got into doing conversion optimization. Was right around, I want to say, probably 2013, 2014-ish. And we somehow ended up discovering Optimizely and started using that as a layer on top of, okay, we're delivering changes, but let's test out the changes first. And so I instituted the testing programs for clients that were interested in it, and just have been doing it from there.
Do you still remember the first test that you ran?
No.
First ish?
No, not at all.
So were they like big redesigns, or like a big version A versus a really big change, or was it just small elements that you started out with?
Nothing wasn't gigantically transformative. We weren't doing an entire site redesign or anything like that. A lot of it was because I have that background in design and UI. That's what I was more focusing on. So doing things like making adjustments to, say, the cart page, or adding an interface feature to the product page, or making navigational adjustments and things like that, rather than promotions or aesthetic based changes. The classic change the button color kind of thing, which is bullshit test. Anyway, but so a lot of it was, I think, in the early stages, optimizing checkout form process, elimination of unnecessary fields, lining up inputs so that it would be easier to parse out the form and different things like that.
So how did this make you a better designer? Doing all these experiments, did it change how you work or how you look at things?
Because I had always not necessarily been distrustful of myself, but more questioning, It
looks nice, but
not just looks nice, but you always how do you I always struggled to find a way to quantify or prove out the value of the work. Like, how do I know that this change actually is more beneficial? Sure, I have, education and training and experience and stuff, but there's always this little bit of doubt in the back of your head, like, is this the right thing for this client or this website or whatever? And so when I sort of discovered split testing, it was like, oh, this is how I answer that question. And I can like prove out like the hypothesis of like, okay, I think this may be better. Let's try it out and see if it works. So absolutely it did make me a better designer because I can make more informed decisions, but also like that openness to essentially be wrong in like, I don't have a vested stake in the success of this in terms of this change. I know this change is better. I want to discover what's the best path to go down. And if it's not this design, do we need to do we stick with what is current, or do we iterate? What kind, how can we change or mutate or evolve what we're working on to be performant?
How big is designing still part of your daily job?
It's pretty big. So the way that I work with clients, I'm basically just an independent single person consultancy, and I do end to end. So I bring on the client, I go through the entire process. I'll do usually work in collaboration with them on test ideation, so coming up with all the ideas and hypotheses and stuff. But then I have a prioritization framework, so we'll run all of the experiment ideas through prioritization, and then I'll design out the changes and build the tests. Write the code in the whatever testing platform, and then execute it, do quality control, proof it out, make sure the test is set up correctly and everything, and then review results analysis with the client. So basically it's like end-to-end service all the way through. I do as much or as little as the client requires.
And we wanted to talk about automation today. You have some thoughts and some ideas on how to do that, right? So first off, what are the things that you are automating, the things that are tedious to you or annoying?
Yeah. So a lot of my work is focused on, like you said, elimination of tedium. Like, I hate being bored with work, in the sense of like, sure, everybody's work is going to be boring in some way, but that doesn't mean your job as a whole has to be boring. And like, as an example,
I mean, some people
like data entry.
Some people find joy in repetitive tasks. I can totally understand that, but for me personally,
it may be like a Zen calming.
Exactly, it can be, but for me also, if it's really repetitive, I need to do it all over again the next time. I'm really gonna try to find a way to automate it.
Yeah, like I enjoy being engaged and thoughtful about my work. Like, I don't enjoy data entry and things like that. As a designer, like, I'm always like thinking creative, like problem solving, not process execution so much. And so I look at like any process that I create, and it's like, how can I standardize this to make it repeatable, both in the aspects of the repeatability lends itself towards trainability so that it can scale. So it's like, okay, if this is you do this thing the same way every time, you can train other people to do it. But then also you can either create tools or leverage something already existing to automate that process. So as an example, like when I have a completed split test and I want to record all of the results because I collate them all to, evaluate program health. Like, okay, if we've run 20 experiments so far this year or whatever, how many of them were revenue generators and this and that. So, you want to store off all your stats, and some of the split testing tools don't really, have like a program management to allow you to collate all that data easily. So you have to do it in some sort of outside fashion, which means you have to transpose your split test result data from the testing tool into your outside source, or using a spreadsheet or something like that, right? So I found it like it would take me 30 to 45 minutes just to record off result data for an experiment. And it's like, I have to do this thing the same way every time. And I'm literally just copy pasting from the web browser into a spreadsheet. And that's like it's like so boring and so an unnecessary thing.
Online Dialog is al 10 jaar een toonaangevend CRO-bureau waar mensen, kwaliteit en kennisoverdracht centraal staan. Ze zijn een specialist omdat ze zich alleen richten op optimalisatie en klantgedrag. Het team zorgt voor online groei en waardevolle inzichten in je bezoekers en optimaliseren samen met jou de verschillende onderdelen van je CRO-programma, zoals websites, sales funnels en customer journeys. Voor meer info ga je naar onlinedialog.nl. Yeah, you're not learning anything from that itself.
Right. It's just tedious, busy work that has to be done as part of the process. But it's like, as a person, I shouldn't have to be doing this, right? Like copying data from one source to another. So I wrote a little JavaScript snippet to where I have it set as a bookmarklet. I can just hit the button. It'll open like a little overlay on the results page. I can say, this variation was the one that I say is the winner, and this and that, and pick a couple other inputs, and then hit submit, and it just pushes off all of the scraped data into my test repository. So something that took me 30, 45 minutes now takes me 10 seconds to do. And for how often I have to do that, it's like in aggregate, how much time am I saving and how much tedium am I eliminating? So doing automating all of those little processes away, like repeatable tasks.
Why did you pick a JavaScript? Why didn't you just use the API of the tool and to push it to a spreadsheet? Or doesn't that work for the tool? Not all tools have a full API available, I guess.
Sure, there's probably some way to do it that way, but that's like the way that I figured it out. Now, to be fair, I use a tool called Airtable to collate all of my test results. It's like an online spreadsheet type of tool, and I'm using their API to push the data in, and it's a JavaScript API. So it's basically so I just write JavaScript to scrape the result data because I'm on the page, and there's it can't be completely automated because there's still a couple touch points of human input that are necessary. So I can't just write an automated script hey, go grab this data. There's still a little human factor involved. So that allows me to pick the points that are necessary for a human decision and then submit the data.
Exactly. Yeah. Any other time savers that you built?
I'm also using Zapier. Which is a great automation tool.
If this, then that for pros, for pro tools.
Yes.
Business tools.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So in that same vein,
which also works with Airtable.
Yes, exactly. So I have an automation set up for when I push new split test result data in. It also runs a Google Analytics report to grab some data from GA for cross-referencing against the split and against the result data as well. So that was also part of the time saver. Another thing like with Zapier.
How would you make sure that the data matches? So the data from the experiment or the segment that you use in the experiment with Google Analytics?
So I'm not the type of data that I'm using in GA. It's really for estimation purposes rather than rather than result analysis. So I'm really only using it say, okay, what was this data captured in GA for the equivalent time frame of the experiment? And then what was that data set going back a year so that I can evaluate a percentage of say traffic or revenue to help determine seasonality time frame for the experiment, for example. To say okay, if this experiment generated an additional $50,000 or something in January, well, how heavy is the site traffic load in January? So we can sort of get a better estimation of is that $50,000 sustainable throughout the year, or is it like, oh, hey, that was peak season, so like it's really not going to generate that much, monthly,
exactly,
or something like that. Yeah.
So you use the GA data to be able to extrapolate the results.
Yeah, to sort of help evaluate seasonality and stuff.
Nice. Yeah.
It's not like
exactly.
it's not like a hard comparison. Though to your point, like I've had thoughts around trying to wrap a process around doing segmentation and stuff with it as well.
I can imagine that's really hard to automate, because you can have infinite kinds of segments in all kinds of ways.
Right. But there could also be like some like common use case ones, like, okay, what was the, the segmentation across different breakpoints, or new versus returning track. There's some common recurrent ones that you could easily automate now, like you can
automate the default ones. Automate the common ones, and then
or even like, earlier in the testing process, define what your segments are, which in my ideation process, I use a hypothesis builder that I constructed. Okay, and it takes it's basically like hypothesis Mad Libs. It has all the different data points. Like we think this, that, and who's the target audience, what pages are going to be. And it's basically like a way to source all of like the experiments framework information.
Yeah.
And so if you could set that up in a way to say like, these are the appropriate segments that we're targeting for the experiment, you could carry that data through and then pull the GA segments that way as well. So it's all a matter of like capturing the data when you need it and then using it at a later time and just turning it into some kind of system or process.
So the form is something you use for the clients to enter the data in, or is something just for yourself? Or
yes, I built it with the intent of getting clients to submit more hypotheses, and also to train them up on that process as well. Because like I meet with my clients every week to just transparency is very big for me, so I keep them like informed and engaged in the process. And so for a long, they'll always come with like new experiment ideas or some level of curiosity, and some perspective that's different for me. Like a really good example, one of my clients, they have their head of customer support on the call every week, and he's bringing in really useful information and feedback that their phone service representatives get all the time from customers. Like a customer will call and be like, "Hey, I was trying to order this, that, or another product and was having trouble this way or that way," And so it's a really good source of customer feedback. But then, we'll be talking about things on our phone call or meeting, and things get lost because, you're taking meeting notes and stuff, but you're discussing a bunch of things. So I was kind of like, how can I capture all of these ideas or also help expand the experiment maturity in the organization by like, here's this like easily shareable like hypothesis input tool. Think of it like a virtual suggestion box almost. Like that was sort of the intent behind it. And I've had difficulty getting traction with the clients like sharing it out. So my struggle now is like, okay, how do I do a better job of like socializing it within the client's organization to start sourcing and really like sort of.
That's definitely something I recognize. That's a lot of even if you make it just a simple form, it's apparently really hard for people to use it. It's way easier for them just to send you an email. Because that's in their system, sending emails, that's fine. Everyone can send emails. But filling out the structured form, you're basically asking them to already think about the whole hypothesis building. Okay, where did the ID came from? What do you expect to happen? For who do you expect it to happen? Those are difficult questions, apparently.
Yeah. And it's hard, right? It's probably tricky for it to be like an organization-wide thing, but it's still probably useful for the stakeholders, and it's also like an educational component. Like for the people that I'm directly interacting with, it's like, here's how you should be thinking of an experiment. Like, it starts with the hypothesis, and these are all the necessary data points to execute and construct a good experiment. So it's also sort of a little training tool as well to scale up the customer's knowledge.
Yeah. In my experience, what might help there depends a bit on the company, I guess. But if afterwards you can share with the results and then say, hey, but that came from this and this guy or girl from customer service because they filled in this form, so we know it came from them, and that's an incentive for people. Oh, maybe I should use a form. So he remembers it's my ID.
Yeah, and I've had thoughts of like, since it's an input form, I mean, you can place it anywhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't place a form in an email, but doing something like on my little like bookmarklet overlay tool, client already uses that for doing test proofing. Like, I could just add that as a feature as well. So it's like, oh, they're looking at the website, they have an idea, they just hit that, and then the form comes right up, and they can fill it out and put it in.
Yeah, I think I added it to intranets, and I also created just like the client URL /AB test ID or just test ID, and then only make it available with internal IPs.
yeah. Like, I have a password protected client portal where it sits now, where they can come and submit stuff, but it hasn't sufficiently gained enough traction.
SiteSpect biedt wereldwijd een unieke AB-testing, personalisatie en product recommendation oplossing. SiteSpect werkt server-side, dus zonder tags of scripts, waardoor een optimale performance gegarandeerd is. De SiteSpect-oplossing elimineert vertragingen en kans op flikkereffecten. Tevens zorgt deze aanpak ervoor dat de huidige en toekomstige browser security regels zoals ITP en ETP geen impact hebben op het AB-testen en personaliseren met SiteSpect. Voor meer informatie hierover ga je naar sitespect.com. So what's the next project that you're gonna be automating? What's the next thing that you're annoyed about?
Yeah.
Or maybe an expansion of the things you already have?
Yeah, so lately I've been doing a lot of work around just more broad project management. So doing things like essentially cutting down on the repeatable tasks that a project manager would traditionally do. So you have sort of like project management software that you're already using, like Basecamp or Trello or Asana or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And someone has to. That tool is only as good as the person managing it. So making it easy to manage and wrangle. Like, I already have a process in place for like, I have experiments essentially broken down into 6 stages of progress. And so when an experiment moves between each stage, that's a trigger for actions to happen, right? So as an example, like if an experiment moves into the proofing or quality control stage, I use like Zapier to automatically post into the project management platform. Like, it creates like the client sign off task and says, hey, this is ready for preview. And then it automatically assembles like the preview link that the client can click on to go directly to their site. And it triggers like the variations and the like a little variation switcher tool that I've built.
Yeah.
And stuff, so that they can actually test and proof out the experiment live on their site, rather than trying to get them to like log into the split testing tool and try and QC it that way and stuff. So it's like removing all these friction points, but then also like taking tedious workload off of my back of like having to create that task and post it and things like that and stuff. Yeah.
And the great thing about Zapier, if you do it that way, is that you can use almost whatever tool the client is using as a project management tool, whether it's Asana or Jira or Trello or whatever. You can probably use that to post a task there. So whatever they're using.
Yes. Yeah. And like my solution currently is cobbled together from Airtable, Zapier, and project management tool. Yeah. Ideally, I would like to have like my own internal tool that's like actually custom and purpose built. That's
Have you ever tried? So I worked before with effective experiments. I want to know if you.
I'm familiar, but I have not. I'm familiar, but I have not tried the tool. But once I discovered it, I was like in my head, I was like, this is probably the thing that I'm envisioning. Yeah. So.
Yeah, the great thing is, so it's a separate tool, of course, so it doesn't necessarily tie into whatever the client is using. But one of the greatest things in my experience with tools like this is that indeed what you said, when something moves from a different stage to another stage, that usually triggers something. So I had a development stage and a design stage, which automatically would email the person responsible for designing experiments or developing experiments. And in the case of developing experiments, it would also automatically create a Jira ticket for the dev team, so they can assign it to whoever they want. And that takes. I mean, if you just run one experiment at a time, it's fine to all coordinate that. But if you go up to, I don't know, 10 experiments, you don't want to message everyone personally
right.
whenever a status of an experiment changes. And then when a tool or workflow like yours can handle that saves so much time.
Right. And there's also, you have to appropriately balance like timing and clutter as well. Like somewhere I used to work.
You can overwhelm people with it, of course.
Exactly.
If you run a lot of experiments. So that's definitely a trade-off.
Or even just with like project management notifications and task assignments and things. Yep. Like if you have to find the right balance. Like if you're notifying people too frequently, it just becomes clutter and they tune out and ignore it. And then when something important actually comes in, well, it's just noise. So it ends up getting deleted. Like I remember somewhere I used to work, they were using Jira and they had it set up so that like when you created a new project, it had maybe a task list of like 40 different assignments and everything would get assigned on project creation. So if you had like 6 things assigned to you, you would get assigned them as soon as they were all created.
Yeah.
But you didn't know when you were able to work on them. Like you didn't know what your blockers were, like what the previous tasks were, so someone had to like actually manage all that stuff, or you had to go in and like monitor it on your own. And that was like, it's just creating too much noise and it's making it more difficult for the people, for the worker to actually find their work and accomplish it. So,
yeah. So what are your other experience with working with clients? I'm curious. So you do, how does the workflow usually look like? So you say you have at least one face-to-face or remote face-to-face meeting with them each week?
Yeah. Yes. I'm of the opinion of like being very, very transparent and collaborative with the client, like building that relationship and getting them involved in the process because it helps them become more invested and more of a stakeholder in the process rather than like, here, I'll run a bunch of tests and you get a report every month or something like that. Like that in-person communication allows you to stay involved, also successfully execute on relationship building, which as a consultant, that's how you keep and maintain clients, is if you have that personal relationship as well. And then also it helps socialize and demonstrate the success of the program too. Like the client more easily shares in like the wins and the feedback. And it also sort of trains them up to expect like individual tests are for information gathering. Like it eliminates that notion of like, oh, well, I'm only going to test things that I think are going to be successful. Like you're testing to answer questions, right? The ROI isn't not that the value is incidental, but it helps disprove that notion of like, oh, I only want to test things that I think are going to be successful. Like I'm like, I have a question about something. Let's find the answer, and then that will eventually lead to a lift in revenue.
Yeah, I usually tell them if you have a success rate of over, I don't know, 40-50% with your experiments, you're not experimenting enough.
Yeah.
You might not even be experimenting. Yeah. You're just testing things you already know for sure, for whatever reason, might work.
Well,
You're very conservative with what you're testing.
there's also another aspect to it, like you quote, like success rate. I break it down in like experiments. I'm sure other people do this too, but I like to reiterate it. Is like you don't have winners and losers. Mm-hmm. You have winners, which are experiments that demonstratively caused a lift on whatever metric you're tracking, and you have a neutral, which is inconclusive. Yeah. But then you also have a save. Like no experiment is a loser. Like you're not losing revenue or losing KPI or whatever. You're saving yourself from doing damage instead. So it's more of like
or wasting a lot of development resources.
Yes, yeah. You're like you're saving yourself from wasting resources stuff, right? You're optimizing spend. Yeah, and so instead of like saying like a 30% success rate, I actually break it down into 3 ways. Like, okay, I find like 25% of the experiments that I run are winners, and then 10 or 15% or whatever are saves. So it's like you have a greater cumulative range of success. Now it's a little harder to quantify. Like, you're not you're
not implementing.
You're not losing. You're not losing money. Like yeah, but there's still like value in saying, we made sure we didn't implement something that actually would have caused damage.
Yeah, and also with looking at things like wins, and if you only look at uplift, especially this month will be a really hard one for a lot of companies. That I mean, either you see you go up 2-3 times, or you go down like 90%. And that's not necessarily because you did a bad job or because you did a really good job. And already this is proving that maybe just conversion rate or just revenue might not be the best metric for what we do.
Yeah, and with every experiment, I sort of look at I don't want to quite say top of funnel metric, but like point of change metric, and then end business result metric, and because they're not necessarily the same. Like point of change is like, what's the action that's taken directly after
adding something to the basket.
Yeah, right. Like if you're making a change on the product page, right? Is it increasing add to cart rate? But then you're still also tracking order conversion and revenue to see, okay, what's the endpoint business lift of the metric as well. Like a really good example I had of that was testing a feature with a client about they had the ability to filter their reviews based on different criteria. And they had done usability testing prior to this. And this was before I engaged with them and instituted the testing program. But they had still done usability testing on the feature and gotten some customer feedback and stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, this is a great feature. Like, we'll love this. This will be super useful, and it users in qualitative feedback responded very well to the feature. But then when we were doing some testing on an unrelated thing on the product page, in some of the session replays and heat maps, I was noticing that like after users engaged with the filtering feature, they were abandoning a lot of times. And so I was curious. It's like, engagement with this feature seems to increase abandonment. So it was a benefit. Like users were saying that it was a beneficial feature, but it was detrimental to the business metric. So there's a dissonance here.
Werk je aan een front-end AB-test en heb je ook last van de bekende flikkeringen in je variaties? Dit kan natuurlijk je testresultaten beïnvloeden en een positief testresultaat neutraliseren. Probeer Convert.com's AB-testing software die Smart Insert technologie gebruikt en die flikkeringen voorkomt. 5 keer snellere support via 24/7 chat, de helft goedkoper en het bedrijf is daarnaast maar liefst 15 keer carbon positive. Je doet dus jezelf, je bedrijf en de volgende generatie een plezier door hun website convert.com/sneller eens te bezoeken. I can imagine if it filters on things that people want, but you don't have the products to match, they will abandon, right? So they like using the filter.
Well, it's not filtering products; it's filtering review information.
Okay.
Yeah. So but what you're saying is correct. And like we were noticing, like the users were engaging with those filters, but they were filtering on so many criteria that they were filtering away all the reviews entirely.
Too many filters,
and being left with nothing. Yeah. And it was an unintentionally negative experience of like, oh well, there's no useful information for me here, so I can't make a decision, so I'm going to leave.
I once had a great sort of small anecdote. A site that offered filtering, but whatever the filters were on top of that page, for some reason, so if you didn't have any results, so if you filtered too far down, if you didn't have any results, they didn't have numbers besides the filters indicating how many results you would get. Mm-hmm. So it was a bit of a surprise they didn't have that feature yet. So people filtered too far down, and then what happened when you didn't get any results, you did get some suggestions of other products that might be interesting in the same category or whatever. But they didn't say they didn't have any results. So what happened? You filtered too far down. There were no results, but you did see products that were not matching your results. There were other suggestions because they didn't want to show an empty page to prevent that from happening, which is in itself might be a good idea. But because they didn't communicate, hey, there's no results, people were very confused. Like I'm filtering down on Samsung TVs and I still see Philips or Sony TVs in my results, or what they think or thought they had as results. So yeah, filtering can be tricky. Yeah. So when we were talking before this, and we're talking about client projects, you also mentioned client onboarding. So basically a step back from the client communication. So what do you do with client onboarding? How do you set the right expectations from clients on what's going to happen, how fast results will be coming in, and that kind of stuff? How do you approach that?
That's an interesting question. So my onboarding process typically takes about a month, and that's mostly from like I have pre-prepared onboarding documentation that outlines like here's program requirements, like expectations, etc. But and then also like technical guides, like here's how you should install the split testing tool and the heat mapping tool, and get logins and reconcile with all the accounts and all that stuff. And then we'll set up like the weekly meeting cycle, and then really the first month is just a lot of like qualitative and quantitative data collection. And in the meetings, it's like a lot of just experiment ideation. So training the client up on like the hypothesis generation process. Like, hey, here's the hypothesis builder. Let's walk through it. You have a couple questions, ideas. So here's, you give them to me and I'll show you like, okay, here's how I would take that and formulate it into a hypothesis or some such. And then,
so you wouldn't be running any experiments in the first month, right?
No.
Or just like an AA experiment, maybe.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'll do a couple like validation experiments to make sure the testing tool is set up correctly and everything. Yes, of course. But other than that, like, no, not really any kind of like hard testing. I mean, it also depends a little bit on how fast the client gets up to speed as well. Like if they have a couple ideas that they're really, really ready to go with, and they have a good development process in place and they can get everything installed and working correctly quickly, then it's a lot of it is dependent on the client. And so some of it is just wrangling of like, hey, did you get that script installed yet? Or,
Yeah. And so, and where do usually are these coming from? Is it you also already mentioned customer service as input for those hypotheses?
So I'll source test ideas from anywhere. Client can submit them, or a lot of the early stage will just be me auditing the site to come up with ideas. Like look at it, do some sort of UI UX audit, look through Google Analytics or whatever analytics tool they're using to identify where some particular drop off points, evaluate like traffic areas, segments,
Exactly.
etc.
And earlier you also mentioned why sticking to planned test runtime parameters is important. I think this is a hot topic for many.
Oh yeah,
many people working directly with clients.
We were actually discussing that a little bit at the weekly stand up today. Someone was asking a question about that. Yeah, and my starting point is really looking at the marketing or the purchase cycle of the segment that you're testing, and seeing okay, if we're testing primarily on first time visitors, and we can determine historically it takes them about 30 days from first site visit to make that first purchase, then the experiment needs to run at least that long to capture first transaction of the first user that came into the experiment. So starting with just your expected purchase or behavioral change time frame, and then using that to estimate out a sample size, feeding that into a calculator to determine your minimum detectable effect, and then evaluating again, and then doing some kind of sanity check on the numbers that you come up with there. So if you get a sample size of 3,000 and an MD of 80%, well, that's completely unreasonable. So it's okay, what we have to reevaluate and change some of these numbers around to get some sort of sane time frame and sane detectable effect.
Yeah, I was talking to a web shop owner, I think 6 months ago, and they sold kitchens online, but the average time there to go from browsing for a new kitchen to actually buying a kitchen is multiple months.
Yeah, that's
if you cannot run an experiment on from first time visitor to actually purchasing a kitchen if the lead time is way over whatever your cookie settings can handle.
And for something like that, it'd almost be more like looking at lead capture or what's a higher touch point.
Exactly. So you need to go for things like that. People going for a brochure or whatever, or just not focus on first time visitors, but the repeat visitors. If someone visited your site 5 times, then it might be a different story.
Right. Yeah.
So what came out of the discussion this afternoon with the roundtable?
Yeah, that was kind of the focus. It was someone is having the question around, how do you evaluate that from a project management standpoint? So I just it just exposed my process. Okay, first I think about it from this standpoint, and then work forward from there, and then do some sanity checks on the information that pops out. And it's is this workable? Is this reasonable? Yes, we can proceed forward, or do we need to make adjustments? For example, I have one client, their purchase time is usually around 60 days. So we're not always testing on transaction, because that's a pretty long purchase window.
Exactly. Yeah.
Overall.
And it could be one of the questions in your workflow. Maybe even just after the hypothesis building, asking those kinds of questions, like what's the business cycle for this? Just to remind yourself.
Yes, and it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? Just to remind yourself, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, that definitely that's something I should be checking first before we build the whole experiment.
Yeah, so I have that broken down. So idea stage. So the first stage is the idea stage, and that's really just coming up with an idea.
Yeah.
There's no not quantifying it or assigning numbers to it at all yet. It's just sourcing ideas, because I don't want to I want to disabuse the client of the notion of like, oh, that's a dumb idea or whatever. Like no, like no idea is a bad idea. Just source everything first. Just like
Yeah.
cultivate a healthy sense of sort of curiosity about the website, like questioning things. So coming up with ideas is just pure text, pure information. Like we think this, so we want to make this change for this reason, right? So just come up with an idea, and then we'll move it into the planning stage, and that's where we start to quantify stuff. So that's the stage where we'll say, okay, what's the transaction time frame for this? What's an estimated sample size? What's an estimated minimum detectable effect? And then using those quantified values as a prioritization method.
Yeah, and you need to check those practical things, right? Can I, like you said, with sample size, can I run this experiment? Does it make sense?
Right. So taking those numbers and then feeding it into like a sample size and a duration calculator, and it's like, does the calculated duration reconcile with our purchase window, and also is it a reasonable time frame to run an experiment? Like I remember one time, I think it was because I made a calculation error actually, but like we ended up running like the sample size calculator and comparing that against like the average daily traffic of the page, and it was like, this experiment's going to take 170 days to run. And I was like, okay, that's there's no way.
Yeah, what I also like to add is usually we already spoke about, you have the different outcomes of an experiment. And I like to force teams up front to think about, okay, if we have these outcomes, what will happen? What would it mean for us? What would change, or what would we implement something? Wouldn't we do anything, or would we run a follow-up experiment? Because if you run an experiment and you have no idea whatever the outcome is, nothing's going to change. Maybe that's not an experiment you should run anyway.
Yeah, and I sort of classify experiments into at least one of two types. There's like prospective and iterative. Prospective are sort of like your big transformative, we have no idea what's going to happen, but this is something interesting. And then your iterative ones are like, those are the sure bets. Like we already have some historical data around here, or it's a follow-up from a previous experiment where we're wanting to refine our changes a little bit more.
Yeah, but even with the big change, you probably have an idea. Okay, if this works, then oh wow.
yeah, and
we can do this, we can do this.
Yeah, and typically the clients, like that's where they're relying on the experimenter's insight, because you have historical experience. Like, oh yeah, I've tested this 6 other times and it worked, 85% of the time or whatever. So.
Yeah, exactly. So that's great, Matt. Thanks for sharing all of that. Last thing I'm interested in, and I mean, you give a lot of inspiration to those clients, and in all the work that you do, the hypothesis that you create for them. So where do you get your inspiration from?
Oh boy.
Well, besides CRO roundtables, that is.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty recent thing actually, but it's healthy, because having that sort of face-to-face vocal communication is way more meaningful and valuable than, say, like LinkedIn comment chains or whatever. Even those are still good and stuff. But it's interesting. Like just general inspiration comes from lots of different sources. I'm very big on UX. I also play a lot of video games. Video games are all about user experience, like in user interface, interacting with the interface is basically how you play the game, and the quality of the interface is going to determine how successful or terrible,
how enjoyable it is.
Right, how enjoyable the gameplay is. Yeah. And so, I've been playing games for like a long time, even just all the way back to the days of like the original like Nintendo or even Atari, right?
But it doesn't necessarily have to be state of the art, right? I mean, we all know Minecraft.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the high resolution that's blowing you away there.
Right. No. And I was a big World of Warcraft player for probably 12 years, and as designer, like completely built and customized out my own interface and control scheme for it that was able to optimize my play. So, and just building off of that experience, and you'll see like a lot of other people who aren't designers, they'll post screenshots of like their interface and stuff, and their screen is cluttered with like 50 different action buttons and stuff. And it's like, you're restricting like your viewport of being able to see what's going on in the play field. And so it's like, what's striking to me was like this really the concept of like timeliness of importance, like timeliness of relevant information. Like there's this huge amount of information that you need when you're playing a game, but not all of it is relevant all the time. Like you only need to know, say this ability is ready for you to use. You only like need to know like when it's available. You don't need to know when it's not available. Like you could hide the icon or something, or like have some sort of like highlight or like glowing field or something. So that sort of like priority of relevance is a big and important feature in gaming. And so like
so it's so the interface is adapting to whatever you need right then and there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so
like I have this I have this Stream Deck right here with all kinds of action buttons. But it depends on the program I have open at that time. So if I have Chrome open, there are different. Well, I don't have any actions for Chrome, but theoretically for Chrome, I could have different action buttons than for Photoshop or for Premiere or for a game that I play.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that, and then I don't know. I've been doing more reading lately, and been picking up like books on consulting and A/B testing and things like that, because I feel like my statistics game is pretty weak. So I've been reading a lot of like more of like the statistics based.
Any recommendations on that front?
Absolutely. I've been reading through George's book.
Statistical methods in online A/B testing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been a very, very good one, useful one. I know a lot of like the less statistically minded people are like, it's really dry and hard to read, but I'm finding it interesting and relevant there, and being able to incorporate those things into the process as well. Like circling back around to like say automation, same kind of thing. Like, okay, I have all of my statistics that I'm trying to calculate, like say in my planning stage. Mm-hmm. Again, that's a repeatable process. Yeah. So I like having to go in and say, manually type a bunch of numbers into a statistical calculator. That's tedious work. Yeah. Like it would be interesting if, say, like some of the split testing tools actually like incorporated those into their and I think kind of in general, most of the split testing tools that I've used do kind of a poor job around the actual underlying statistics of the test, like helping to determine and evaluate detectable effect and if you have like a reasonable sample size and things like that. Like they're erring too far on the side of simplicity, and that's kind of where, like, not that CRO has like a bad name or anything, but that's where you get like a lot of like the snake oil kind of things, where you see people like posting test results online, or like writing a case study where they have like, oh, we tested 300 visitors and got a 250% uplift after 2 days. And I'm like, sure, your results are full of shit.
Well, your results probably just fine, but it's it's not going to be useful for you in the future.
Right.
Yeah, that happens, and it helps if you have some understanding. But do you also, so you read books? Do you also do like online courses? Is that something that's that you do, or is reading books more useful to you?
I think reading has been more useful to me, and also just my own just online shopping experiences. Like I'll go out and look at e-commerce sites and be like, oh, here, it's kind of interesting the way that they're doing this or that or something, and take notes and solicit feedback and do things like that. So just like just observational journeying.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. For me, I try to both read books and do online courses. I think it takes me more effort to open a book than starting an online course. That's easier for me. But I'm definitely way more distracted when I'm behind my computer. So I definitely, when I do an online course, definitely need to shut down everything that's that's available. Ideally, if possible, also download the online course and then just do it from my computer without any Wi-Fi on to minimize distractions. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't really gotten into online courses.
You said you started reading books, but is that a recent change because of the whole coronavirus thing, or was it already on?
No, I've always been a book reader. Yeah. I'm more of like a reading and an experiential learner. So for me, it's more like I'll read about something, then I'll go do it and try it.
Yeah, you have your notebook on the side saying, okay, this is something I should incorporate in my nifty.
As an experimenter, right? Try it, test it, fail at it, figure out what didn't work, and
fail again. Yeah. Exactly. Matt, thanks so much. It was lovely talking to you. Our time is up. Thanks so much. Yeah, we have some links to include in the show notes. So everything we spoke about, for example, the book, you'll find a link in the show notes below in this podcast. Thanks again, Matt. Good luck reading and building those automations. If you have more, please share them with us. We definitely want to know.
Will do. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt, for giving us some inspiration on what we can automate to make our work lives a bit less tedious. Good luck with all what you do, and talk to you soon. This was Season 2, Episode 17 of CRO Cafe with Matt Beischel from Corvus CRO. And as always, the show notes can be found on our website, cro.cafe. Although we started out as a Dutch podcast, we are putting out more and more English content. If you want to skip all the Dutch content, please go to cro.cafe/English to see an overview of our English episodes and to subscribe to get notified about new English episodes. If you're interested in promoting your products or services to the best CRO podcast listeners in the world, please take a look at cro.cafe/partner to see how we can collaborate. Next week, another English episode where I talk to the person that kickstarted the COVID-19 conversion rate aid package, aka COVID crap. Rahul Doraiswamy and I'll be talking about what COVID crap is and how you can join as a CRO specialist or as a business. Talk to you then, and always be optimizing.